Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the sources of international law. If we agree that international law is really law, then we have to see, where does it come from? Where does it come from? We know that every law has to have a source. There has to be a source for every law, and we need to know that source in order to understand the law and its obligations and the rules that involve the enforcement of that law. So we have to know the sources of the law. Now, fortunately, when we're talking about international law, there are certain agreed definitions of international law, and there are certain agreed sources of international law. And those are three sources. They're generally considered to be three sources of international law. Where does the international law come from? And we'll talk about those three sources. So in this lecture, we're going to study the sources of international law. Where does it come from? So where does international law come from? Well, we describe international law really in two ways. First of all, the United Nations has defined the sources of international law, and the Restatement of Foreign Relations Law has defined the sources of international law. Now, fortunately, these two entities, the United Nations and the Restatement is a group of professors and practitioners who don't create the law, they don't make the law, but they describe what the law is. But fortunately, these two sources of the law, these two descriptions of the sources of the law are the same, that there are three ways of describing the sources of international law. Now, when it comes to the United Nations, it is the International Court of Justice, the judicial branch of the United Nations. In Article 38 of the UN Charter, it says that there are three sources of international law. And the first of those is international treaties and conventions. And as we'll talk about, a convention just means a large-scale treaty, a treaty involving more than two countries. Now, it would make sense that the UN references this source first, because the United Nations is an entity created by a treaty. And so therefore, according to the United Nations, the highest source of international law is international treaties and conventions. Now, the second source of international law is what we call customary international law. And we'll talk a lot about custom, but essentially it means, how do countries interact with one another, and how have they traditionally interacted with one another? And we'll find that there are certain practices that are so common that we consider them to be the law, even though there's nothing in writing that says it's the law. It's simply custom. But custom is just as binding as if there was a written source of the law. And the final source of the law, according to the United Nations, refers to general principles of the law recognized by civilized nations. And what they mean here is that there are some principles of law that are common across legal systems. Civil law, common law, Sharia law. There are certain principles of law that are reflected in each of those systems. And therefore, those domestic laws, if they are widespread enough and if they are universal enough, then they become international law. Now, general principles is definitely on the third rank, the third tier of sources, and it's the same in the other, as described in the other source, because it's not meant to be an authoritative statement on what is the law. General principles is used, what we in the law call a gap filler. It's a gap filler. If there's a gap in the law that is not covered by a treaty or covered by custom, a court or an arbitration panel can rely on general principles of law to fill in that gap. If they find that that gap can be filled by a principle that is the same across legal systems, then that's what the general principle of law source refers to. Now, the restatement of foreign relations law, and again, a restatement is not the law, but it's a description of the law. It's more like an encyclopedia designed to tell you what is the law. Well, the restatement states that a rule of international law is one that's been accepted by the international community of states. So, under the restatement definition of the sources of the law, the highest source of the law is customary law, customary international law. And we define that as the general and consistent practice of states that are followed out of a sense of legal obligation, that states follow these rules not just because it's a good idea, but because they believe them to be the law. When we were talking about freedom of the seas is not encapsulated in a widespread treaty, not a treaty signed by everyone, including the United States, who specifically not signed the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, but nevertheless the United States recognizes that concept, freedom of the seas, as being the law. It's a custom, and we follow it out of a sense of legal obligation. Now, the second source, according to the restatement, is international agreements. And just as with the United Nations description of the sources, this refers to treaties and conventions. International agreements create the law for those parties that have signed the treaty, that have executed the treaty. The treaty, therefore, becomes binding law on those countries, even though there was not a sovereign to issue that command. Finally, general principles, again, the same thing, the gap filler. They are supplementary. They are supplementary rules of international law. And again, the restatement says that we don't want to use these general principles as custom. They don't rise to the level of custom. But if there's a gap in the law, then we can refer to these general principles to fill that gap. And we'll talk more about what those general principles are.